The howling wind whipped at the lone figure, trudging through knee-deep snow, each step a battle against the merciless blizzard that had descended upon Breckenridge, Colorado, with sudden fury. Jane Addams clutched her thin wool coat tighter around her slender frame, her gloved fingers numb despite her efforts. The stagecoach driver had apologized profusely before abandoning her at the edge of town, claiming the roads ahead were impassable and that she would find the ranch of her intended husband just 2 miles west. What he hadn't mentioned was how quickly visibility would deteriorate to mere feet ahead, or how the biting cold would seep through every layer of her city clothing. It was December 1878, and Jane was beginning to think she had made the gravest mistake of her 22 years. The advertisement in the Chicago newspaper had seemed like divine providence 3 months ago. Hardworking rancher seeks educated bride of good character, comfortable home awaiting the right woman, travel expenses paid. Now, as she stumbled forward, her trunk dragging behind her through the snow, Jane wondered if she would even live to meet the man she had agreed to marry. Her foot caught on something beneath the snow, and she tumbled forward, face plunging into the icy white. For a moment she lay there, tears freezing on her cheeks as exhaustion threatened to overcome her. The temptation to rest, just for a moment, pulled at her consciousness. "Not like this," she whispered, forcing herself to her feet. "Not after coming so far." Ahead, through the curtain of swirling white, she thought she saw a light. Hallucination, perhaps, born of desperation and cold. Yet she moved toward it, dragging her trunk with renewed determination. The light grew steadier, and then shapes emerged, the outline of a structure, the vague impression of a fence line. Her heart leapt. A building. Shelter. She pushed forward, her numb legs barely responding to her commands. The wind changed direction, momentarily clearing her vision enough to see a ranch house with a broad porch. A lantern hung from a post, swinging wildly in the gale, the beacon that had drawn her forward. As Jane approached the steps, the front door flew open. A tall figure emerged, wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat. He moved with surprising agility through the snow, reaching her in seconds. Without a word, he took the trunk from her frozen grip and wrapped a strong arm around her waist. "Inside," he commanded, his voice barely audible above the storm. Jane allowed herself to be guided up the steps and through the doorway into blessed warmth. The contrast was so stark that her skin prickled painfully as sensation began to return. The man set her trunk down and quickly closed the door against the invading snow and wind. In the sudden quiet, Jane could hear the crackling of a fire and feel its heat beckoning her. She turned to thank her rescuer and found herself looking into the most striking pair of blue eyes she had ever seen. They belonged to a man perhaps 30 years of age, with a strong jaw partially hidden beneath a neatly trimmed beard flecked with premature silver. He was removing his coat, revealing broad shoulders and the practical clothing of a rancher. "You must be Jane," he said, his voice deep and clear now that they were inside. He moved to a chest near the door and pulled out several furs. Without ceremony, he wrapped them around her shoulders. The pelts were luxuriously warm, and Jane sank into their embrace gratefully. "You're early," he added, studying her with an intensity that made her heart quicken despite her exhaustion. "Early," Jane stammered, her voice hoarse from cold. "Your letter said you'd arrive next week on the 15th. He guided her toward the fire. "I'm Frank Hartwell." Jane's mind was clouded with cold and fatigue. The stagecoach schedule changed. I wrote again, but mail's been irregular with the weather. Frank gestured to a rocking chair positioned close to the hearth. "Sit, you're half frozen." Jane sank into the chair, the furs still wrapped tightly around her. The heat from the fire was almost painful against her chilled skin, but she didn't move away. Frank disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a steaming mug. "Drink," he instructed, handing it to her. "Coffee with a measure of whiskey. It'll warm you from the inside." Jane normally would have declined spirits, but survival overruled propriety. She took a cautious sip, coughing slightly as the whiskey burned a path down her throat, followed by the welcome warmth of the coffee. Frank knelt before her and began unlacing her boots. "These are soaked through. Your feet will be frostbitten if we don't get them dry." "I can," Jane began to protest. "You can barely hold that cup steady," Frank replied, not unkindly. "Let me help you before you lose toes." Jane fell silent, simultaneously embarrassed and grateful. Frank worked efficiently, removing her boots and sodden stockings. Her feet were alarmingly white with patches of angry red, not black, thankfully, which would have indicated severe frostbite. "Wiggle your toes," he instructed. Jane complied, wincing at the pins and needles sensation. "Good sign," Frank said. He rose and retrieved a basin, filling it with water that steamed slightly. "Not too hot," he explained, placing it before her. "Warming too quickly can damage the tissue." As Jane submerged her feet in the lukewarm water, Frank brought a towel and more furs. He worked methodically, checking her hands and face for signs of frostbite while maintaining a respectful distance otherwise. "How did you end up walking in this weather?" he asked, as he added wood to the fire. "The stagecoach couldn't continue," Jane explained, feeling warmth slowly returning to her extremities. "The driver said your ranch was only 2 miles from where he left me." Frank's expression darkened. 2 miles in good weather on a clear road, not in a blizzard across open country. He shook his head. "You could have died out there." "I nearly did," Jane admitted quietly. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of how close this meeting had come to never happening at all. Frank cleared his throat. "Are you hungry? I've stew on the stove." At the mention of food, Jane's stomach rumbled audibly. She blushed, but Frank merely nodded and disappeared into what she presumed was the kitchen. Left alone, Jane took in her surroundings. The main room was larger than she had expected, with sturdy furniture built for function rather than fashion. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that suggested Frank Hartwell was more than just a rancher. A writing desk stood in one corner, papers neatly stacked upon it. The home was undeniably masculine but clean and ordered. No half-empty bottles or discarded clothing that might suggest dissolute habits. Jane felt her shoulders relax slightly. Her greatest fear, that she had committed herself to a man of low character, seemed unfounded. Frank returned with a bowl of stew and a slice of bread. "It's not fancy," he said, setting it on a small table beside her, "but it's hot." "Thank you," Jane replied, taking the spoon he offered. The stew was simple but delicious: chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots in a rich broth. She hadn't realized how famished she was until the first bite, and then she had to consciously slow herself to maintain some semblance of manners. Frank fetched a bowl for himself and sat in a chair opposite her. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the wind howling outside a stark reminder of what Jane had escaped. "Your letters didn't mention you were quite so determined," Frank said finally, a hint of admiration in his voice. Jane looked up from her bowl. "I don't believe I am particularly. I simply had no choice but to continue once I was set down. Many would have sought shelter in town rather than press on." "The driver mentioned no such option," Jane replied, "and I was eager to reach my destination." She hesitated. "I hope my early arrival hasn't caused inconvenience." "No inconvenience," Frank assured her. "The house is ready. I've been preparing for your arrival." He paused. "Though I had planned to meet you properly in town with the preacher present for introductions. Jane felt a flush creep up her neck that had nothing to do with the fire. Here she was, alone with a man to whom she was not yet married, in a remote ranch house miles from town. It was hardly the proper beginning she had envisioned. "Perhaps when the weather clears, we can still meet with the preacher," she suggested. Frank nodded. "Of course. Until then, you'll take my room. I'll sleep out here by the fire." "I couldn't possibly displace you. It's not open for discussion," Frank interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "You've endured enough hardship for one day." Jane found herself too exhausted to argue further. After they finished eating, Frank showed her to his bedroom, a simple space with a large bed covered in quilts, a chest of drawers, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. "There's water in the pitcher," he said. "Your trunk is here. I'll leave you to get settled." He hesitated at the doorway. "If you need anything, just call. I'll be in the main room." "Thank you," Jane replied. "For everything." Frank nodded once and closed the door behind him. Alone, Jane sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up to her. She had traveled over 1,000 miles to marry a stranger, nearly died in a blizzard, and now found herself in his home, dependent on his kindness. It was not at all how she had planned to begin her new life. With shaking hands, she opened her trunk and changed into her nightgown, hanging her damp clothes on a chair near the small stove in the corner of the room. She washed her face and hands in the basin, then plaited her long brown hair into a single braid. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and Jane's last thought before succumbing to exhaustion was that Frank Hartwell seemed to be a decent man, certainly better than the alternative she had left behind in Chicago. The following morning, Jane awoke to sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-muddled mind. Then the memories of the previous day rushed back: the blizzard, her rescue, and the quiet, intense man who had saved her. She dressed quickly in her warmest dress, grateful that her trunk had somehow remained relatively dry despite being dragged through snow. Her city clothes would need supplementing for the Colorado winter, but they would suffice for now. When Jane emerged from the bedroom, she found Frank already awake and tending the fire. He looked up at her approach, his expression warming slightly. "Good morning," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Much improved, thank you," Jane replied. "The rest was exactly what I needed." Frank nodded. "Hungry? I've got coffee and can make breakfast." "Please allow me," Jane offered. "It's the least I can do after your kindness yesterday." For a moment, Frank looked as though he might refuse, but then he gestured toward the kitchen. "The stove's already hot. Provisions are in the pantry." Jane set to work, finding eggs, bacon, and the makings for biscuits. She worked efficiently, familiar with cooking despite her city upbringing. Her father had died when she was 16, leaving her to care for her ailing mother until her passing the previous spring. Those years of responsibility had taught Jane many practical skills. As she cooked, she was aware of Frank watching her from the doorway. "You seem at home in a kitchen," he observed. Jane glanced over her shoulder. "I've had practice. Your letters mentioned caring for your mother." "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple acknowledgement touched Jane more than she expected. "Thank you." They ate breakfast at the kitchen table, the silence between them more comfortable than the previous evening. Through the window, Jane could see that the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a brilliant blue sky and a landscape transformed into a sea of white. "It's beautiful," she murmured, gazing out at the snow-covered mountains in the distance. "It can be deadly, as you discovered," Frank replied, "but yes, beautiful too." After they finished eating, Frank rose from the table. "I need to check on the livestock. The storm will have caused some damage that needs tending." "May I come with you?" Jane asked impulsively. "I'd like to see the ranch." Frank hesitated, It's bitter cold out there. I have my coat, Jane said, then added with a small smile, and perhaps you could lend me those furs again. Something like amusement flickered in Frank's eyes. Very well, but you'll need proper boots too. He disappeared briefly and returned with a pair of fur-lined boots. These might be large, but with extra stockings, they'll keep your feet warm. Bundled against the cold, Jane followed Frank outside into the dazzling morning. The snow reflected the sunlight so intensely that she had to squint until her eyes adjusted. Frank's ranch was larger than she had imagined, with several outbuildings clustered near the main house and fenced pastures stretching toward distant tree lines. "How many acres do you have?" Jane asked as they trudged through the snow toward the nearest barn. 800, Frank replied. "Started with 110 years ago and added more as I could." "All by yourself?" Jane couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Frank nodded. "I have helped during busy seasons calving, branding, driving cattle to market. But day to day, it's just me." He pushed open the barn door and they stepped into the relative warmth inside. The barn housed several horses and a few milk cows. Frank moved among them with practiced ease, checking each animal while explaining his operation to Jane. She listened attentively, asking questions that revealed her genuine interest. "You know something about ranching?" Frank asked as they moved to the next outbuilding. "Only what I've read," Jane admitted, "but I'm eager to learn." Frank looked at her thoughtfully. "It's a hard life, different from Chicago." "I'm aware," Jane replied. "I didn't come expecting ease, Mr. Hartwell." "Frank," he corrected, "if we're to be married, you should use my given name." The direct mention of their arrangement brought a flush to Jane's cheeks. "Frank," she repeated, testing the name. They spent the morning touring the ranch, Frank pointing out features of the land and explaining his plans for spring planting and the small fields he maintained for feed crops. Jane's admiration grew as she realized the extent of what he had built alone. By midday, they returned to the house, both chilled but invigorated by the fresh air. As Jane helped prepare a simple lunch, she found herself thinking that she could be content here in this life with this serious, hard-working man. "Tell me about your family," she ventured as they ate. "Your letters mentioned parents in Pennsylvania." Frank's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father was a blacksmith in Lancaster County. He and my mother still live there with my younger sister and her family." "Do you visit them?" "Not for some years," Frank replied, his tone suggesting he didn't wish to elaborate. Jane nodded, respecting his reticence. "And what brought you to Colorado?" "The war," Frank said after a moment. "After Gettysburg, I couldn't go back to my father's forge. Needed open spaces, room to breathe." He looked at her directly. "Many men came west after the war for similar reasons." Jane understood what remained unspoken, that the horrors he had witnessed had driven him to seek solitude and a fresh start. She didn't press for details. "And you?" Frank asked. "Why answer an advertisement from a stranger in Colorado?" It was Jane's turn to choose her words carefully. "After my mother died, there were complications with the family home. A cousin claimed rights to the property through an old loan to my father." She stared into her cup. "I had few options. Teaching positions are scarce, and I have no relatives who could take me in." "So you chose a stranger in a strange land," Frank observed. "I chose a new beginning," Jane corrected gently. "Your letters were honest and direct. You offered partnership, not charity." Frank studied her for a long moment. "You're either very brave or very desperate." "Perhaps both," Jane admitted with a small smile. The afternoon passed with domestic tasks. Jane took inventory of the pantry and suggested improvements to the organization of the kitchen. Frank worked on harness repairs at the table, his large hands surprisingly dexterous with the leather and tools. As evening approached, Frank announced that he needed to chop more firewood. Jane took the opportunity to prepare a more substantial dinner than their midday meal, finding a selection of root vegetables to add to the stew and mixing dough for fresh bread. The familiar work calmed her, providing a sense of purpose in this new place. Through the kitchen window, she could see Frank at the chopping block, his rhythmic movements powerful and efficient. There was something reassuring about his steady presence. She realized a dependability that she instinctively trusted. When Frank returned with an armload of split wood, the kitchen was filled with the aroma of baking bread and simmering stew. He paused in the doorway, an unreadable expression crossing his face. "Something wrong?" Jane asked, suddenly uncertain. Frank shook his head. "No, it's just been a long time since this house smelled like home." The simple statement touched Jane deeply. She busied herself with setting the table to hide the sudden emotion that welled up in her. Over dinner, Frank seemed more willing to talk than before. He told her about his herd of cattle, the challenges of ranching at this altitude, and his hopes for expanding his operation in the coming years. Jane listened, offering observations and questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding his work and his ambitions. "You're not what I expected," Frank said as they finished the meal. "Is that disappointment or relief?" Jane asked, only half joking. "Relief," Frank replied without hesitation. "Your letters showed intelligence, but they didn't capture your resilience." "Surviving a blizzard is hardly everyday resilience," Jane pointed out. "It's not just that," Frank said. "It's the way you've stepped into this situation, this house, this life without complaint or apparent fear." Jane considered his words. "I am afraid," she admitted. "But fear serves no purpose unless it prevents foolishness, and I've already committed to this path." Frank's expression softened. "We should discuss what happens next." "The wedding," Jane said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Yes." Frank leaned back in his chair. "The snow will keep the passes blocked for at least a week, possibly longer. We can't reach town until they clear." "I see." Jane folded her hands in her lap. "Our arrangement in the meantime. You'll continue to have the bedroom," Frank said firmly. "I'll sleep by the fire. We'll maintain propriety until we can be properly married." Relief mingled with an unexpected twinge of disappointment in Jane's chest. "That seems wise." "Once the roads are passable, we'll go to town," Frank continued. "Meet with Reverend Collins, make the arrangements, unless..." Jane prompted when he didn't continue. "Unless you've reconsidered," Frank said, his voice carefully neutral. "Seeing the reality of this place, this life, it's different from imagining it from Chicago." Jane was surprised by the offer. "Are you hoping I'll reconsider?" "No," Frank answered, the single word carrying weight. "But I want you to be certain. Marriage is binding, especially out here where divorce is rarely granted." Jane studied the man across from her, this tall, serious rancher with calloused hands and watchful eyes. She had come west with trepidation but determination, seeking security if not happiness. What she had found was a man of integrity and quiet strength, whose home, while simple, offered more genuine welcome than she had known in years. "I haven't changed my mind," she said softly. "Have you?" Frank held her gaze. "No." The simple exchange sealed their commitment more effectively than any formal ceremony could have done. They would marry, build a life together, and face whatever challenges arose as partners. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Jane took over the household duties, bringing order and warmth to spaces that had been maintained, but not truly cared for. Frank taught her about the ranch operations, showing her how to milk the cows and care for the chickens, explaining his breeding program for the cattle and his plans for spring planting. In the evenings, they sat before the fire, Jane often mending or knitting while Frank read aloud from one of his many books. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing pieces of their past, building a foundation of knowledge about each other. Jane learned that Frank had been a reluctant soldier, enlisting out of duty rather than patriotic fervor. He spoke little of the battles, but sometimes mentioned comrades lost with a quiet grief that suggested wounds not fully healed. He had come west immediately after the war, working on established ranches until he saved enough to stake his own claim. In turn, Jane told Frank about her childhood in Chicago, her father's work as a bank clerk, and the long illness that had claimed her mother. She explained how her cousin Martin had produced a loan document after her mother's death, claiming the family home as repayment. With no funds to contest his claim legally, Jane had been forced to seek alternatives. "He gave me 2 weeks to vacate," she recalled, her voice tight with the memory. "I saw your advertisement the very next day. It seemed providential." "Your cousin sounds like a scoundrel," Frank observed, stoking the fire with more force than necessary. "He is," Jane agreed, "but his actions led me here, so perhaps I should be grateful to him after all." Frank looked up, catching the small smile on her face. "You have a remarkable way of finding silver linings, Jane Addams. When you've watched someone you love suffer for years, you learn to find brightness where you can," she replied simply. As they conversed each evening, Jane found herself increasingly drawn to this complex, thoughtful man. Frank Hartwell was nothing like the brash cowboys of dime novels or the rough frontiersmen she had been warned about. He was educated, well-read, and possessed a quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. He was also, she had to admit, handsome in a rugged way that she found increasingly distracting. His tall frame moved with a natural grace that belied his size, and when he occasionally smiled, a rare event that Jane had begun to cherish, his entire face transformed, revealing glimpses of a younger, less burdened man. For his part, Frank seemed to be warming to Jane's presence. He began asking her opinion on matters beyond the household, listening attentively to her suggestions about ranch improvements or potential crop rotations. He noticed when she arranged wildflowers on the table and commented appreciatively on the new curtains she sewed for the kitchen windows. Small gestures of growing affection appeared, Frank bringing home a bolt of fabric from a supply cache he kept in one of the outbuildings, Jane setting aside the choicest pieces of her baked goods for his lunch, both of them lingering longer in conversation before retiring each night. On the 10th day after Jane's arrival, Frank announced at breakfast that the pass to town had been cleared. "We can go tomorrow if the weather holds," he said, watching her reaction carefully. Jane felt a flutter of nerves. "To see the Reverend," Frank nodded, "and to shop for whatever you need. Winter's just beginning, you'll need proper clothing and supplies." "I don't want to be an expense," Jane began. "You're to be my wife," Frank interrupted gently. "Your needs are not an expense, they're a priority." The simple declaration warmed Jane more than any fire could have done. "Thank you," she said softly. That evening, as they sat in their customary places by the hearth, an unusual tension filled the air. Tomorrow would change their arrangement permanently, binding them legally as husband and wife. "Are you nervous?" Frank asked, breaking a lengthy silence. Jane looked up from her knitting. "About the wedding, a little," she admitted. "It's a significant step, even though we've agreed to it for months." "We could wait longer," Frank offered. "Get to know each other better first." Jane considered this. "To what end?" "We've decided to build a life together. Delaying the formalities won't change that decision." "No," Frank agreed, "but it might make you more comfortable." "I am comfortable," Jane said, realizing as she spoke that it was true. "More than I expected to be, honestly." Frank's expression softened. I'm glad to hear it. He hesitated, then added, I want you to be happy here, Jane, not just secure or settled, but genuinely happy. The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. I believe I can be, she replied. I already find contentment in this home, this life. She paused. And in your company. Frank's eyes darkened slightly at her words. He rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, taking the knitting from her hands and setting it aside. Then, to Jane's surprise, he knelt before her chair. I realize we've done this backward, he said, his voice low and earnest. Meeting after agreeing to marry, living under the same roof before exchanging vows. He took her hands in his larger ones. But I want to ask you properly, now that we've met, now that you know what life here would truly be like. Jane's heart quickened as she realized what was happening. Jane Addams, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need security or because I need a helpmate, though both those things are true, but because I believe we could build something worthwhile together, a partnership of mutual respect and growing affection. Tears pricked at Jane's eyes at the unexpected tenderness of the proposal. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you, Frank Hartwell. Frank's hands tightened on hers. For a breathless moment, Jane thought he might kiss her, but instead he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. It was my grandmother's, he explained, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl set into it. I've had it in my strongbox, waiting for the right moment. Jane stared at the ring, touched beyond words that he had planned this gesture, that he had a family heirloom he wished her to wear. It's beautiful, she managed. Frank took her left hand and gently slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if meant for her. Now it's official, he said, satisfaction evident in his tone. Without thinking, Jane leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. Thank you, she murmured, pulling back slightly. Frank's eyes had darkened again, and this time he didn't hesitate. His hand came up to cup her face, and he leaned in slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. When she didn't move away, he closed the distance between them, brushing his lips against hers in a kiss that was gentle but unmistakably filled with promise. It was Jane's first kiss, and she found herself responding instinctively, her hands moving to rest on his shoulders as the contact deepened slightly. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing more rapidly than before. Tomorrow can't come soon enough, Frank said, his voice husky. Jane felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she held his gaze. No, it can't. The following morning dawned clear and cold. Jane dressed with particular care in her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the hazel of her eyes. She arranged her hair in a more elaborate style than usual, securing it with combs that had been her mother's. When she emerged from the bedroom, Frank was waiting in the main room, dressed in what was clearly his finest clothing, a black suit that, while not fashionable by Chicago standards, was well made and suited his broad-shouldered frame. His eyes widened appreciatively when he saw her. You look beautiful, he said simply. Thank you, Jane replied, taking in his transformation from rancher to gentleman. You're quite handsome yourself. Frank offered a rare, full smile. The horses are hitched to the sleigh. We should reach town by noon if we leave now. The journey to Breckenridge was Jane's first opportunity to see the surrounding countryside properly, without the blinding curtain of a blizzard. The landscape was breathtaking, snow-covered mountains rising in the distance, forests of pine and aspen, and occasional glimpses of frozen streams winding through the valleys. Frank pointed out landmarks as they traveled, his deep voice mixing with the jingling of the sleigh bells and the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves. Jane found herself imagining making this journey in different seasons, seeing the land transform through spring wildflowers, summer greenery, and autumn gold. As they approached Breckenridge, Jane felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This would be her first introduction to the community she would now be part of, and first impressions mattered in small towns. The town itself was larger than she had expected, a proper mining and ranching center rather than a tiny frontier settlement. Main Street boasted several substantial buildings, including a hotel, general store, bank, and church. People moved about their business despite the cold, many nodding and greeting as Frank guided the sleigh through town. Their first stop was the church, a simple white building with a modest steeple. Frank helped Jane down from the sleigh, his hand lingering at her waist slightly longer than strictly necessary. Reverend Collins was a portly man with a jovial demeanor that immediately put Jane at ease. He welcomed them into his study, expressing delight at finally meeting Frank's bride-to-be. "Mr. Hartwell has been one of our most respected citizens since he arrived in the county," the Reverend told Jane, "though I must say he's kept rather to himself until now." "The ranch demands most of my attention," Frank replied evenly. "Indeed, indeed," Reverend Collins agreed. "But a man needs more than work to sustain him. I'm pleased you found a companion, Mr. Hartwell." The arrangements were quickly made. The Reverend would perform the ceremony that afternoon at 3 o'clock, allowing time for Frank to take Jane to the general store for supplies and to introduce her to a few key members of the community. "Nothing elaborate," Frank assured the Reverend, with a questioning glance at Jane. "A simple ceremony is perfect," she confirmed. As they left the church, Frank turned to Jane. "Are you hungry? We could have lunch at the hotel dining room." Jane nodded, suddenly realizing she was famished. "That would be lovely." The Breckenridge Hotel was the largest building in town, a 3-story structure with pretensions to grandeur that weren't quite realized in execution, but were charming nonetheless. The dining room was half full when they entered, and Jane was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. Frank seemed oblivious to the attention as he guided Jane to a table and held her chair. A waitress approached immediately, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Hartwell, we don't often see you in town for meals," she said, her gaze shifting curiously to Jane. "Miss Peterson," Frank acknowledged with a nod. "I'd like to introduce Miss Jane Adams, my fiancé. We're to be married this afternoon." The waitress's mouth formed a perfect O of surprise before she collected herself. "Congratulations to you both. How wonderful." Word of their presence and their impending wedding spread quickly through the dining room. Throughout their meal, various townspeople approached to introduce themselves and welcome Jane to Breckenridge. She met the banker and his wife, the town doctor, and several ranchers who were clearly friends or business associates of Frank's. Jane handled the introductions with natural grace, her city upbringing evident in her polished manners. She noticed Frank watching her with quiet approval as she navigated the social interactions. "You're making quite an impression," he murmured as they finished their meal. "Everyone has been very welcoming," Jane replied. "Though I suspect they're mainly curious about the woman who captured the attention of the reclusive Mr. Hartwell." Frank chuckled, the sound warming Jane from within. "You're probably right. I haven't given them much to gossip about over the years." After lunch, they visited the general store, where Frank insisted Jane select everything she needed for the coming winter warm clothing: boots, fabrics for sewing, and personal items. He spoke briefly with the proprietor about delivering larger items to the ranch when weather permitted, then purchased a heavy wool shawl that he immediately wrapped around Jane's shoulders. "A wedding gift," he said when she began to protest. "The first of many, I hope." Their final stop before returning to the church was the jewelry store, where Frank selected a plain gold band for himself to match Jane's pearl ring. "I never thought I'd wear one of these," he admitted as the jeweler sized his finger. "Having second thoughts?" Jane asked lightly, though there was a hint of genuine concern in her voice. Frank took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Not a single one," he replied firmly. By the time they returned to the church, Jane was surprised to find several people already gathered inside. Reverend Collins explained that word had spread about the wedding, and a few townspeople had asked permission to attend. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "Folk here are always glad of a celebration, especially in winter." Frank looked to Jane, leaving the decision to her. She squeezed his hand reassuringly. "It's fine," she said. "It's nice to know we're welcomed." The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Jane stood beside Frank before the altar, her hand trembling slightly in his as they exchanged vows. When Frank slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her grandmother's ring, the symbolism of the moment struck Jane. Forcefully, she was binding her life to this man's. For better or worse, in this remote mountain community, far from everything she had ever known. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Frank hesitated only a moment before leaning down to place a gentle kiss on Jane's lips. The small congregation applauded, and several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. After accepting congratulations from those present, the newly married couple stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight. The temperature had dropped, and the sky held the promise of more snow. "We should start back," Frank said, helping Jane into the sleigh. "I don't like the look of those clouds." Jane nodded her agreement, settling the new shawl more securely around her shoulders. As they left town behind, she felt a curious mixture of emotions: excitement, nervousness, and a deep sense of rightness that surprised her. "Mrs. Hartwell," Frank said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Jane looked at him, the new name sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Yes, Mr. Hartwell," a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Nothing. I just wanted to say it aloud." His eyes returned to the road ahead, but his free hand reached for hers, entwining their fingers atop the buffalo robe covering their laps. The return journey seemed both longer and shorter than the trip to town, longer because of the anticipation building between them, shorter because the weather was indeed worsening, forcing Frank to urge the horses to a faster pace. They reached the ranch just as the first snowflakes began to fall. Frank quickly stabled the horses while Jane hurried inside to stoke the fire and prepare a simple supper. By the time Frank joined her, stamping snow from his boots on the porch, she had soup warming on the stove and fresh coffee brewing. "It's going to be another blizzard," Frank announced as he hung his coat by the door. "Not as severe as the one that brought you here, but enough to keep us snowbound for a few days." Jane nodded, suddenly aware that they were truly alone now, not just as before, but as husband and wife, with all that implied. Her hands trembled slightly as she ladled soup into bowls. They ate by the fire, the comfortable routine of the past days now overlaid with new awareness. Frank seemed content to let the evening unfold naturally, making no demands or presumptions. They spoke of the day, the people Jane had met, the supplies they had purchased, the unexpected attendance at their wedding. As the evening wore on, the wind outside strengthened, rattling the windows and creating a cozy cocoon of warmth and intimacy within. When Jane rose to clear the dishes, Frank caught her hand. "Leave them," he said quietly. "Come sit with me." He guided her to the bearskin rug before the fire, settling beside her with their backs against the hearth. For a long moment, they simply watched the flames in silence. "I want you to know," Frank said finally, his voice low, that I expect nothing from you that you're not ready to give. Marriage means different things to different people. Jane turned to face him, touched by his consideration. What does it mean to you? Frank considered the question seriously. Partnership, he said after a moment. Loyalty, building something lasting together. He paused. And companionship in all ways, but only when freely offered and desired. The firelight cast shadows across his features, highlighting the strength in his jaw and the unexpected vulnerability in his eyes. Jane reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his beard. I may be inexperienced, she said softly, but I understand what marriage entails. I wouldn't have agreed to become your wife if I wasn't prepared for all aspects of that role. Frank caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. There's no hurry, Jane. We have time to know each other better. We do, she agreed. A lifetime. But I don't want to begin that lifetime with unnecessary distance between us. Something flickered in Frank's eyes, relief, desire, and something deeper that Jane wasn't ready to name. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. When she didn't, he kissed her with more intensity than before, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. Jane responded instinctively, her arms winding around his neck as she learned the contours of his mouth. The kiss deepened, and Jane felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire at their backs. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Frank rested his forehead against hers. I should warn you, he murmured, that I've wanted to do that since I found you in that blizzard. Jane smiled, her heart racing. And I've wanted you to, since you wrapped me in those furs and made me feel safe for the first time in longer than I can remember. Frank stood and offered her his hand. When she took it, he lifted her effortlessly to her feet and into his arms. May I carry my bride to our room, Mrs. Hartwell? He asked, his voice husky. Jane nodded, suddenly beyond words. As Frank carried her toward what was now their bedroom, the howling wind outside seemed a distant echo of the storm that had brought her to this place, to this man, to this moment. Later, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, the fire in the small bedroom stove casting a warm glow over their skin, Jane marveled at how quickly life could change. A month ago, she had been alone and adrift in Chicago, facing an uncertain future. Now she was Mrs. Frank Hartwell, wife to a Colorado rancher, beginning a new life in a landscape as vast and promising as the love growing between them. What are you thinking? Frank asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Jane smiled up at him. That sometimes the most frightening journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations. Frank's arms tightened around her. I'm glad your journey led you here, he said simply. Even if you did arrive early in the middle of a blizzard. Especially then, Jane replied, nestling closer to his warmth. It gave us time to discover that what we were seeking in a practical arrangement might actually be something far more precious. The months that followed proved Jane right. Winter gave way to spring, bringing new life to the ranch calves in the pastures, seedlings in the fields Frank had plowed, wildflowers dotting the hillsides. Jane thrived in her new role as rancher's wife, learning quickly and bringing her own ideas to the operation. By summer, she had established a substantial kitchen garden that supplied their table with fresh vegetables, started a small flock of chickens that produced more eggs than they could use, and begun making cheese from the milk of their cows, some of which Frank took to town to sell on their regular visits. Their partnership flourished in all aspects. Frank, who had lived alone for so long, found unexpected joy in sharing his life and his home. Jane, who had feared she might never find genuine happiness again after her parents' deaths, discovered that love could indeed grow from respect and shared purpose. When autumn came, painting the aspen trees gold and bringing crisp nights that hinted at the winter to come, Jane shared news that brought tears of joy to Frank's eyes. "A child," he whispered, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our child." Jane covered his hand with her own. "Due in late spring, the doctor thinks. Just in time for the wildflower season." That night, as they lay in the bed they now shared without hesitation, Frank held Jane close and made a confession. "I never told you why I placed that advertisement," he said, his voice quiet in the darkness. "It wasn't just for practical reasons, though those were part of it." Jane waited, sensing he needed to say this in his own time. "After the war, I thought I'd never want closeness again. Too many lost friends, too much suffering witnessed." His hand stroked her hair absently. "I built this ranch, made it successful, but something was missing. I tried to ignore it, but the emptiness just grew." "What changed?" Jane asked softly. "I realized I was building something with no one to share it with, no one to continue it after I was gone." Frank's voice grew stronger. "I wanted a family, Jane, a true home, not just a house where I slept between days of work." Jane pressed closer to him, her heart full. "And now we'll have that family." "We already do," Frank corrected gently. "You and I, we became family the moment you trudged through that blizzard into my life. The child will only add to what we've already built." The following April, as wildflowers indeed carpeted the meadows around their ranch, Jane gave birth to a son they named William, after Frank's father. The birth was difficult but ultimately successful, with the town doctor arriving just in time to assist. Frank, who had faced battle without flinching, found himself nearly undone by the hours of Jane's labor. When it was over, when he held his son for the first time and saw Jane's exhausted but radiant smile, he knew a completeness he had never imagined possible. "He has your eyes," Jane murmured as Frank placed the swaddled infant back in her arms. "And your determination," Frank replied, remembering how forcefully their son had announced his arrival. "He'll be strong like his mother." As spring turned to summer, the ranch flourished along with their growing family. Frank hired 2 permanent hands to help with the expanding operation, allowing him more time with Jane and William. The house grew too, with the addition of a proper nursery and an expanded kitchen where Jane could pursue her increasingly successful cheese-making business. By the time William was walking, Jane was expecting again a daughter they would name Elizabeth, after Jane's mother. Their family was complete, or so they thought, until 3 years later, when twin boys Michael and James surprised them both. Through it all, the joys and challenges, the growth of their ranch and their family, Frank and Jane's partnership remained the steady foundation on which everything else was built. The practical arrangement that had begun with a newspaper advertisement had blossomed into a deep and abiding love, strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. On particularly cold winter nights, when the wind howled around their now expanded home, Frank would sometimes wrap Jane in the same furs he had used that first night and remind her of how she had arrived early, a joke that became part of their family lore. And Jane would smile, remembering the frightened young woman who had stumbled through a blizzard toward an uncertain future, never imagining the warmth and love that awaited her. She had arrived early, yes, but precisely when she was meant to. On their 20th wedding anniversary, with their children growing tall and the ranch prospering beyond what either had imagined possible, Frank presented Jane with a journal bound in soft leather. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Open it," Frank urged. Inside, in Frank's strong handwriting, were the words, "The story of us, from the day you arrived in that blizzard until today." Jane leafed through the pages, tears filling her eyes as she read Frank's account of their life together, the challenges they had overcome, the joys they had celebrated, the family they had created. The final entry, dated that very day, concluded, 20 years ago, I wrapped a half-frozen woman in furs and told her she was early. It was the most fortunate timing of my life. Every day since has confirmed what I suspected even then, that Jane Addams Hartwell is the courage, the heart, and the soul of everything we've built together. I thank God for blizzards and brave women who walk through them, changing the course of a solitary man's life forever. Jane closed the journal and looked up at her husband, his face now lined with 2 decades of Colorado weather and experience, his hair more silver than brown, but his blue eyes still as piercing and kind as the day they had met. I would walk through 100 blizzards to find you again, she said softly. Frank took her hand, the hand that had worked alongside his to build their life, the hand that had comforted their children, the hand that still fit perfectly in his own after all these years. You'll never need to, he promised. I'll always be right here, keeping the fire lit to guide you home. And he was, for all the years that followed, through children growing up and starting their own families, through the continued expansion of their ranch into one of the most prosperous in Colorado, through the changes that transformed their corner of the West from frontier to established community. The mail-order bride who had arrived in a blizzard and the cowboy who had wrapped her in furs had found something neither had dared to hope for when they entered their practical arrangement, a love that warmed them through all seasons, strong enough to weather any storm, enduring enough to leave a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. For in the end, it wasn't the ranch or the children or even the memories they created that mattered most. It was the partnership they had forged, day by day, choice by choice, growing stronger with each challenge faced together and each joy shared between them. And when visitors to the Hartwell Ranch commented on the obvious affection between the aging couple, Frank would smile and tell them it all began with a blizzard and a woman who arrived early, the best mistake of timing in the history of the Colorado Territory.